I was a senior in college, my professor gave me a strange-looking tool and said, "Here, see what you can do with this." I asked her what it was, and she said it was a janting. It was used for batik. I'd never heard of the word batik or janting. I threw it in with all my other tools and went to my next class and didn't think much about it. Later on, I went to the library and looked up the word batik. There wasn't too much information other than it was a wax resist method used in Java particularly, and it was a way of decorating fabric. The method is you paint hot wax onto fabric and then dye the fabric. The wax resists the dye. You can either then remove the wax or add another layer and dye it again. Well, this sounded intriguing, and the tool was interesting. It looked like a little teapot on a handle. I took it home and started experimenting. My first experiments were disastrous. I tried shaving wax and heating it over a candle, which gave it all this soot would run down on the fabric. But then I spent a summer experimenting on big sheets. This is the first of one of many large batiks I did that summer. It's very faded, but it was done with Rit and Tentex dyes on old cotton sheets, so it has not withstood the test of time. But something about the fluid wax and the overlapping dyes just was intriguing to me, and so I continued to work in batik. Here's a detail of that piece. I first did very simple batiks. Many of them were one or two colors, like this one. I soon switched from cotton to silk and started using finer jantings. They come with different spout sizes, and I found the finest would give me a very thin line that I could control. If the wax wears away, you get this erosion or cracking. And if you keep the wax pliable, it allows for these large areas without too much cracking. Here I've used the cracking to emphasize the teasel design. This was again on cotton. This is on silk. I went from these large floral pieces to a whole series of vegetables and fruits. These were very simple, fairly small pieces. They were on silk, which I began to use pretty exclusively. Often the series would include many ideas of one theme. For instance, an apple. I must have done dozens of apples in different designs. Citrus of different kinds. Here's a detail of a piece that was grapes. I did a series of these that were presented for wall cover designs to, I believe, Goodyear. They did not go with any of them, but it was a fun project to work on. Green beans from the garden. At this point, I was starting to show my batiks and sell them in galleries, and the fruits and flowers were a popular theme. Remember that the silk starts off as white silk, so every color you add has to overlap the color you've already put on there. In this case, it went from white to pink to red to blue. Where you see the dark dots on the strawberries are areas that did not receive wax. So it takes a certain amount of control to make those little round dots. This is a detail of that piece. There was a whole series after that of suns and moons and stars. These were large hangings. They were sewn onto fabric backings and hung as you would a wall hanging. This is one of the sun pieces. There was also a series of angels. These again were large silk pieces that were eventually mounted onto fabric. As I developed, I stopped mounting things on fabric and started stretching them onto bars, stretcher bars, because it gave a more satisfying surface. You didn't get these wrinkles. There was also a series of birds and other kind of whimsical characters. I did a series of scarves that I tried to market at one point. These were more abstract all-over designs. This is a detail from one. Here's another. And then there were a whole series of flower patterns. Some were very simple, as this one, which is probably 1, 2, 4, or 5 colors. Sometimes I would do a series based on the same dyes. So, for instance, this piece and the one previous to it were all done at the same time using the same dye baths. This is another floral piece. This one I used a lot of beeswax in the wax mixture. Beeswax stays pliable so that you don't get the breaking or the cracking. You don't get the veining that is popular with batik. I liked it without the veining. I liked having the control of where I wanted veining and where I didn't. Here's another detail of a flower piece. Batik is normally a flat pattern process. Because the piece is submerged dyed, the color takes over the whole piece of fabric. To try to add a little depth, I've tried to add very subtle colors so that you start getting a depth of field. Not only do you need the technical expertise of handling the wax, but you also need to understand color, because every color you see is overlapped. Once the white fabric is dyed the first color, every color will be affected by that. In this case, it was light blue, then another shade of light blue, then a darker shade, then a dusty shade, then a green, and finally a purple. Here again, starting with white fabric. I never drew on the fabric, so I had to keep the design in my head. I'd visualize it, and then you kind of work backwards. You put in the detail. In this case, the whites were put in. Then it was dyed a pale yellow, then waxed again. Then it was dyed a little deeper yellow, then orange, then to get the colors. This is another of the many flower series. There must have been dozens of these small flower pieces that were very popular in local galleries. Some were large. This piece is about 3 feet tall. This is another large piece. Sometimes it was very difficult to see the individual colors that made up a piece, but you were aware of the depth and richness of the color. In this case, it's on white silk, but there are 3 or 4 shades of tan and yellow that make up the flower petals. Your eye doesn't pick those colors up, and yet you see a richness and a 3-dimensional quality that normally a flat pattern would not achieve. This is a good example of subtle dyeing. The Queen Anne's lace are made up of 4 different shades of white and tan. Again, your eye doesn't pick it up immediately, but they give you a depth and a laciness that would not be there if it was all just one color or white. The subtle shades of green have to blend the blue and the tans by adjusting the amount of green, the amount of yellow. You can get various new shades. Some colors you can't overlap. You don't get primary colors usually in batik, because once you dye it red. If you dye it blue, you're going to get purple, or if you dye it yellow, you'll get orange. Here's a detail of the Queen Anne's lace. The little dots that form the flowers are actually made up of 4 different shades of tan. There was a whole series of butterflies and other little creatures among the flowers. The work became a little more complex at this point. I started adding more color. If I could do 10 colors at one batik, I would try then for 12 colors on the next, or 15 colors. The pieces ended up toward the end of my batiking to have as many as 40 colors in one piece. This piece was done with very special German-made jantings that were so fine that you could do these just ribbon little hairlines of wax, which gave a wonderful detail to the sunflowers. This is a detail of the piece, and you can see the white lines. I drew the lines first and then added the color. And you can see how fine the lines could be. This was one of the very original Pittsburgh hillsides. I had been doing hillsides in my paintings and woodcuts and etchings. And so I took that idea of the texture of houses on hillsides and experimented with the batik. This would lead to an entire body of work based on Pittsburgh hillsides. Here's another one of those early pieces. And another. The early textural hillsides gave way to house patterns. Some were just straight out, as in this case it was just rows of houses, one on top of the other, on top of the other. On this piece, the Pittsburgh Hillside series played with a lot of textural effects, the geometry of window, boxy houses, pointed roof. I like the idea of the repetition and the patterns you could create with the repetition. Pittsburgh is a town of cobblestone and brick. Here it's an abstraction of brick roads, brick hillsides, cobble streets. Sometimes the scenes were at day, sometimes they're night scenes. In this case, there was a lot of cracking, crazing as the wax eroded, which allowed the blue, the final blue dye, to sink into what had been the white areas of wax. This gives this kind of ethereal blue tone to the foreground houses. Some were very systematic in how they used color. Often if there were 4 or 5 colors on a bottom row of houses, the next row would drop a color, add a color, and then the top row would drop a color from that row and add a color. This gives a rhythm to the pattern. Even if you're not aware that these changes are being made, you're aware of the rhythm of the piece, the design. Here again is one of the very systematic ones. The top row has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colors. The next row down drops 1, adds 1, and so forth, all the way down to the final lower row that has the darkest of the dyes. You have to understand color pretty thoroughly in batik because you don't have a lot of color to work with. It's easy to go from a piece of white silk to a very dark piece in just a few dye baths. In this piece, the two rows of smoke coming out of the chimneys are the same color. What makes it look like different color is the surrounding color. It's the same theory that is used for Persian rugs to extend the color perception of the rug designs. This piece won first prize at a National Craft Council show back in the 60s, I believe. I was fascinated by the shapes and textures of the factories. Pittsburgh was a factory town. And I did a series based on houses that led up to factories. This piece, I tried folding the silk. If you look closely, you'll see a seam down the middle. So a very fine China silk was folded in half, stretched very tight, and waxed all the way through. After it was waxed and dyed all the many colors, then the wax is removed by an ironing process where you iron it between newsprint, not printed newspaper, but newsprint paper. And that absorbs the wax and frees the silk. And once it was ironed out, then it was unfolded and became the complete piece. Oops. Here's another very textural piece. And another. Usually I would explore one theme. If I did it one way, then I would think, well, how can I change that or alter it? Sometimes it was adding texture. In this case, there's a lot more breakage of the wax in this piece than the former piece. And it balances with the solid areas of the rooftops. There was also a series that I call the New Jerusalem series. There's a song Joan Baez sings, and she talks about when we tear down the ghetto and build a New Jerusalem. Well, I was kind of picturing that New Jerusalem was going to be these tract homes where they tear down everything, build the house, and then plant a small tree where a huge one had been torn out. This is your basic one-car garage New Jerusalem. And this went on to be a series of New Jerusalems. This one had the contoured two-car garage with contoured landscaping. And this one was the brick model. Notice there are 2 trees in each yard. This one was based on a song by Crosby, Stills and Nash about our house. And if you look closely, you'll find the 2 cats in the yard. Also, you'll notice it's like a chicken in every pot. There's a Volkswagen in every garage. At the time I was doing the Pittsburgh series, I took a bus trip across country with the children and was fascinated driving through kind of the seamy parts of town late at night on these Greyhound buses and looking into windows, and you'd get the glimpses of people's lives. Sometimes it was just a pattern of color or light. Sometimes there would be figures. So I began the window series. This is another of the window series, showing children looking out. This was followed by a whole series of children's games, children at play. This was a popular theme. These are fairly small pieces. They're probably 18 by 24 or thereabouts. And again, if there was one theme of children playing ball, there would be a dozen different batiks with different formats. The children dressed differently, the colors arranged differently, the patterns slightly different. This was a commission for a preschool teacher's retirement. This was one where the cobblestones really came into play. This very abstract texture of brick and the children's clothing patterning. There was a lot of cracking in the white, which patterns itself after the brick pattern. This is a detail of that one. It's called a Rainy Day Parade. I also would do pieces for my children. I had 2 preschoolers at home while I was working, and they would get bored having me just sitting there working all morning. So I would always have a painting or two, a batik or two, that was to their themes, something they chose. This was my son's digger. He loved digging machines. So he would watch for a while, and then he'd go find something to play with. So there are a whole series of themes for the children. Here's another one. This is called Rex the Wonder Dog, and if you look closely, you'll see 2 little eyes looking out of the doghouse. That's Rex. Another one of cars and buses. About this time, I was doing a whole series of drawings based on circus themes. I had done a series of paintings and drawings, and one of my first major solo shows had been a circus theme show. So it seemed natural to then add circus theme to the batiks. I did a whole series of circus batiks. Again, often in themes. There were a lot of these balancing pictures. Here's another one. There were also lots of animals and nets and performers. I ended up doing quite a lot of these and writing an alphabet book, and these are the illustrations. There's one batik for each letter of the alphabet. Addison Wesley had wanted to publish it, but this came right in the late 70s when publishing had just kind of collapsed. The printing had gone overseas and the costs had tripled. Publishing costs had tripled. Most publishers were no longer doing books that they liked. Every book had to carry its own weight. So we tried to make this into other than an alphabet book, but it just didn't work out. Would have made a wonderful children's book. These are more of the circus pieces. The circus drawings are pen and ink, and they're very much like this, except black and white. There was usually some sort of humor going on in each one, as in this one that says 1, 2, 3, jump, and the poor sheep is standing on the diving board looking down into that bucket, as if he's not sure he wants to jump. All of these were done on white silk, white china silk. This one I prevented the cracking so that you get this wonderful texture of squares and diamonds with very minimal cracking. I like the idea of masks, and the masks are often the same face as what's behind the mask, or the masks sometimes are worn on the back of the head so that the person really has 2 faces. So there was a series of figures with masks. To get the transparency of the light beam, it's created by very, very thin lines of wax. In this circus batik, the beam of light was done by waxing very fine lines early in the dye bath process. There are 2 shades of yellow forming those light beams. I like the idea of the texture of audience and have used that in both the woodcuts and the ink drawings and paintings, and also the batiks, where the sea of heads becomes a textured area. In this one, the nets became a pattern that were repeated. And if you look closely, you'll see there's a diamond pattern in each net. Often they were storytelling, because these were meant for children to look at and to give words to. It was a book with very simple words that the child was to then verbalize with. Juggling was a fun theme, and there were many juggling images. This is an audience image. Here again, the light beams were done by thin lines of wax, that then as the rest of the batik was waxed and dyed, it looked almost transparent, that you could look through the thin lines. This was a favorite of my children. Here again, the nets and the rigging were part of the design. By the mid-70s, my work had become very detailed and quite large. I would go to New York twice a year for silk. I'd slip around the garment district and try to haggle and bargain, looking for the best deals with China silk. The widest silk I could get was first 42 inches, and then I found some that was 52. This allowed me to do a 52 width in this case, and then as long as I wanted, I'd get this by the bolt. Pittsburgh was continued inspiration. Pittsburgh houses became a very rhythmic mathematical progression of geometric shapes. Here's another one that is very precise in color placement and pattern. This is a detail. Since I did not draw a head on the silk, I would have to picture the piece and then picture all the many different colors that it would be waxed and dyed, and keep that in my head, and then work from the highlights, the light areas to the dark areas. I'd also incorporate a certain amount of pointillism. I'd use little dots of wax and gradate the colors very subtly in order to form volume. Here's a detail showing the little dots that form the treetops. Sometimes a piece would break if there wasn't enough beeswax, or if the wax or the dyes were cold, or if the wind blew the wrong way. In this piece, I just let it crack. I was not real pleased with it and just wanted to see what would happen if it just continued to crack and crack. I tended to like the batiks that did not crack because I had more control over them, but this did give an interesting texture. I'd also fold the silk. In this case, I folded the silk at the waterline, waxed and dyed the entire piece, creating the upper half. I removed the wax, unfolded, waxed out the top half, and then re-waxed and dyed the lower half, creating the darker colors for the reflection. This one is a large piece. It's about 40-some inches wide and probably 50-something high. And you'll notice that it's all with brick and cobblestone. Again, Pittsburgh textures, bridges. The bridges were always an inspiration in Pittsburgh. It's a city with 3 rivers and lots of bridges. This was a folded silk, creating the pattern of reflection of bridges. Sometimes the pieces were horizontal, sometimes they were vertical. In this horizontal composition, the hillsides and the houses form columns. In the late 70s, I took a trip with the children across country. We had a camper van, a VW camper van, and we went for the summer crossing the country. Everyone said, "Oh, you'll be bored, silly, by the time you get to Kansas." Well, I got to Kansas and thought it was magnificent. There were seas of grass, these beautiful patterns of waving grass and huge skies. I just soaked in all the images, and when I got back to my studio after the summer, I had an outpouring of grass and meadows and cloud patterns. I tried to capture the motion of wind in the grass by creating little chevrons, by carefully articulating various directions in the color of the grass. One could create kind of a rhythmic energy or a rhythmic motion. This was a grass field where each little blade of grass was articulated. There was a series of marshes where, again, trying to create this motion, the feeling of water and wind and reeds. In some of the marsh pieces, there were dragonflies or butterflies. Sometimes that theme would be repeated just to experiment with where color was placed and how motion in the wind and the flying insects could be captured. There were also a whole series of forest images, various times of day, various times of year. This is a bright summer piece. This is a night piece. These also incorporated that dot, dot, dot pattern. The tops of the trees have at least 4 colors, which your eye doesn't pick up, but you see a volume that you wouldn't see otherwise. This is a wheat field. It's one of the pieces that came after our cross-country trip. Each little blade of wheat is articulated. Here's another wheat field. I was trying to capture the roll of the field as wind would go across it, and it would actually look like it was rolling. I experimented with skies too, trying to capture light beams and clouds and patterns. Here's a close-up of the rolling fields, and if you look closely, you'll see every little piece of wheat is articulated. There are at least 24 colors, all told, in the yellows, browns, and golds. In the mid-70s, I went to the Borrego Desert for the very first time. It was spring, and I took my 2 youngest children, and we spent a couple weeks out in the desert. And I was just amazed at the imagery. The mountains lit up by the sunset. I experimented with a lot of different mountain images, and then the desert floor. The little sparkly things are blooming flowers in the sand dunes. This batik is of a night scene of the desert with the blooming verbena and the citrus trees in the background. Some of the batik pieces were very complex. This one has many, many colors into those sand dunes in the foreground. Each dune is created by tiny dots of wax, and the colors very carefully gradated to get the curve of the dunes. The sky on this piece too is made up of fine lines. If you look closely, it's as if the beams from the sun are radiating out to the corners of the batik. Along with the many desert images, I've always been fond of Pittsburgh meadows and have used that as part of my imagery for a long time. By the late 70s, these were a very popular format. I had many commissions for desert meadows. If you look closely on this one, you'll see dragonflies and little beetles in the grass. This is another meadow made up of leaves, trying to create that feeling of texture and wind and flower. This is the detail of the piece. These little flowers are maybe a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch at the biggest. These are very tiny dots of wax creating the flowers and the leaves and textures. You can see by the detail the very subtle colors that went into this piece. Here's another meadow, again made up of very subtly dyed transitions of colors from yellows to greens. This one defies what batik color can do. The blues were put in first. An entire palette of shades of blue were first dyed. Then pinks were added, which turned the blue into a more lavender color. After the lavender came various shades of orange, until finally one that I could get a strong orange. So the piece has both blue and orange, technically difficult to get in batik. This is a detail of the piece. These little flowers are maybe 1/4 inch at the biggest, maybe smaller. The little dots of wax are about the size of the head of a pin. This is the same piece as it transitions up to the orange. And you can see by gradating from the blue to pinks to almost yellows that then this allowed the orange dye to take hold. And this is the top of the piece. Many times I would hide things within a batik. In this one it looks like a summer meadow, but if you look very closely in among the grass, you'll see it's filled with beetles and bugs and grasshoppers. This is even a bigger detail. The grasshoppers are less than 1 inch across. And as the more you look into the grasses, the more you will see of these little insects. Here's another one that looks just like a regular meadow, but if you look very closely, it's filled with bumblebees. This is a meadow with dragonflies, and I was experimenting with trying to make their wings transparent in the same method as I did for the circus spotlights. The wings are made up of very fine lines of wax, and the cracks between the lines allow for the continuation of wax and dye. This gives a transparent appearance to them. Another meadow. If you look closely, you'll see the insects all through the grasses. And another. Lily pad pond was created by folding the silk in half, waxing through the double layer, and then removing the wax and opening the piece up. This piece is called Sand Dunes. It took almost a year to do. It's a large piece. It's about 50 inches wide and maybe 60-some inches high. It's made up of little dots of wax. Every sand dune is created by dots of wax and very subtle color. The foreground sand dunes have at least 4 or 5 colors, and as they transition up through the piece, each dune has at least 5 or 6 colors. So it's add a color, drop a color as the colors get darker. Midway through this piece, I came out one morning and found a big piece melted right in the center. I was fit to be tied, couldn't understand it. Had to remove all the wax, re-wax everything that had been waxed, and start again. About a month later, the same thing happened, but this time I found cat hairs in the wax. My cat had been sleeping on the piece at night because it was near the heater. So after locking the cat out of the house, again, the wax was removed, the old parts covered with wax, and the rest continued with the fine dots. This is a detail of the foreground. And as the piece goes up, you can start to see the subtle transitions of color that make up the sand dunes. And this is the very top of the dunes. This is a picture of a retrospect show I had at Kip Gallery at Indiana University. It's the only picture I have of the big snow meadow piece. This was the largest piece I ever did. It's 10 feet wide and about at least 4 feet high. It's made up of 3 panels because the silk gets too heavy to handle as one piece. So I would register it, wax it, put all 3 pieces together in exactly the same lineup, and dip them into the dye at exactly the same time, so the color would be absolutely consistent on all 3 pieces. This process was repeated for each color used. This one was difficult because I had to think in terms of what was going to have snow, which was the first white waxing. I didn't draw on the silk, so I had to keep in my head how to reverse out the darker stems coming up through the snow. This is not a very good photograph, but it shows you the thinking that had to go on. Everywhere you see a little brown twig is an area that did not get waxed. The white areas were waxed first, and everything else then was added. The piece hangs in the Library of Congress. Here's a detail of another snow piece. It gives you an idea. To show how the snow was melting, I used a shade of gray around the outside, and this too had to be registered so that the twigs and branches came up through not only the white wax, but also the white waxing, but also the next color, the gray color. This is another detail of the piece. It shows you the seam. If you look closely to your left, you'll see what looks like a line, and that's where the 2 pieces of silk have come together. It was tricky to register. Here's another smaller snow piece, but the same thinking. To get the trees on the hillside, everything that's white was waxed and everything that's dark was left open without wax so that it would take the darkest of the dyes. Here's the detail. This is another one of the large images. In this case, it was a 2-piece batik registered, and is one of the meadows where if you look closely, it's filled with beetles and little insects and bugs. There's a detail, and you can start to see the little ladybugs, little mushrooms. This piece was probably the most complex piece I ever did, and sadly I do not have photographs of it except for this, which was taken at Carnegie Museum when it was hanging there in a show. The piece was destroyed by accident, which was very unfortunate. It's a 3-panel, very complex piece with a very detailed meadow pattern. This is a detail of it. You'll notice the sky is made up of a very fine lines that create a texture, and the register from panel to panel had to be pretty precise. I did a series of winter pieces. I was intrigued by colors of winter. I love the mauves and browns and tans, the dry, dark colors of winter. Here's another winter piece. Again, trying to capture wind in the grass, which had been an ongoing theme both in the Kansas pieces and the marsh pieces, the meadows. This is one that's this winter stubble, and it's done with that pointillism method I created. But this time, rather than just dots, I was using little tiny lines to give a stubble effect. Unfortunately, I've not photographed all the work. Often a piece was being finished and the client was waiting for it in the living room as I put the last nail in the frame. So not all the work is documented. Much of what you've been looking at are one or two out of bigger series. This is a series of figure panels that happened because I had a broken furnace. My studio had steam heat, and in the wintertime the furnace would pump out heat and you couldn't shut it off. So my apartment would usually stay at about mid-90s. This meant I could do large pieces and keep the wax pliable. So these are larger than life-size figures done on very sheer silk. This one was doubled and waxed through 2 layers and then opened up and redone. I didn't draw on the silk, but I would draw the figure out, this is a detail of it, on large paper, and I'd put the paper under the silk. The silk was up on a frame about 2 inches above the drawing. I could see through the silk enough that I could see the drawing and be pretty accurate with it without having pencil marks on the silk. One of the few series that I actually drew the plans out before making the batiks. This is the bottom half, and you'll notice that there's also a waxing in the foreground of pieces that come and cut through the double images. They were waxed first before the silk was folded. Then it was folded, and those areas were continually waxed to keep them from eroding. There were an entire series of these figures. I used the idea of the folded double image, as in this one. And then some were a repeat of a single figure. This shows the foreground, how it's waxed up through the piece before the piece was folded. The trick was to keep that fold line from breaking so that you didn't get a line of dark along those foreground stems. In this one, the figures are kind of a yin-yang, larger than life size, and on very large pieces of silk. I think the silk is about 7 feet long. Here's again figures. I like the idea of creating motion with the figures. Some of them were just stacked. Others, by rotating the figure, it's almost as if they were falling or turning in space. That one doesn't show very well. It's one of the full figures. This piece was one that I painted into while it was wet. It was waxed and dyed, and while the flesh color dye was still wet, I very carefully painted just a shade darker in some of the curved areas, which then bled down in through the wet fabric, creating a soft transition. This creates the volume you see. Here's a detail. Because my apartment was so hot and I was using straight beeswax, you'll notice that there's very, very little cracking in all of this. I also used the figure as kind of body parts for landscapes. There was an entire series of hills and mountains made of breasts and bottoms and armpits and various other body parts. There was a series that I have no photographs of that also used kind of the human scale like this, and it was a series of waves. It was ocean views. It was from a commission that then I started a series from. By the end of the 70s, I was ready to quit batik. My doctor was scolding me about the dyes that were very poisonous. And the very final batiks I did were a series that were commissions. And I used the same dye baths for all of them, but they're all very different. In this one, I've used the idea of the brick hillsides and the houses along with the meadow, and then the silhouette of smoke and trees and houses at the top. In this one, it's the meadow with the houses in the background. There's almost a very nouveau feeling to the smoke as I look at it now. Here's a detail. If you look closely, you'll see that those houses are not just one solid color. The roofs of the very back row are one color. The roofs of the foreground row, a shade lighter. And then each plane of the house, the back ones are darker than the front ones. So there are at least 5 colors just in those house designs. And then the smoke is another even darker color. This is a detail of the foreground. Very detailed work. Here's another of the Pittsburgh patterns. This one uses that linear pattern to create the sky. The clouds are made up of very fine lines. This is a detail. It was a little bit bittersweet to come to the end of the Batik era. I was ready for a change and truly enjoyed taking a paintbrush and bold color and not having the tedium of sitting for hours and hours a day dotting wax. But it was also the end of a very creative period, and it took a while to shift. This is again one of the very final pieces, as is this. This one to me exemplifies Pennsylvania meadows and mountains. And we'll end with a detail of this one. If you look closely, you'll see all the little dots of wax and the subtle colors. Batik is a fascinating medium. The fluid wax is unforgiving. The dye, you get one crack at and that's all. So it kind of makes you push toward perfection. Years later, I would put all my information about Batik into a book that I wrote, Batik for Artists and Quilters, which is like a mini workshop